A top-tier voice actress, a bombshell body, and now she has an army of penguins. They just keep finding ways to make Melt best girl. Hello everyone, Soberoni of G&A Reviews here, bringing you a spotlight for the only servant whose dancing can legally be considered assault with a deadly weapon, Melt Lancer. We'll be examining her stats and skills, as well as going over pointers to how to utilize her effectively, and an overall grade comparing her to how she stacks up to the other 4-star servants. So if you're ready to join the dance with Melt, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and ring my bell so that you can catch all of these spotlight videos as they go up and help out the channel. But for now, on to Melt's stats. Summer Melt has a max HP of 11,749 and a max attack of 9,261, which becomes 9,724 due to her Lancer class modifier. For a 4-star Lancer, Melt has very low HP, but slightly above average attack. While compared to the rest of the 4-star servants, her HP fares much better, being middle of the pack, and her attack is a little above average. When it comes to her command cards, Melt has 4 hits on her quick card, 2 hits on her arts, 3 hits on her buster, and 5 hits on her extra card. She has an NP gain rate of 0.76% and a star rate of 12.1%. Melt has very average but balanced stats for a 4-star, which gives her a little versatility. She also has strong NP gain and star generating due to her high hit counts and high NP gain rates. Taking a look at her skills, Melt's first skill is Swan Lake rank A. This increases her own arts card effectiveness for 5 turns between 10 to 20% depending on level. Her second skill is Perfect Fluid rank B. This grants her 1 turn of invincibility, and it also increases her own buff removal resistance for 1 turn between 50 and 100% depending on level. Finally, it also changes the field to a waterside battlefield for 3 turns. And her last skill is Melt Envy rank EX. This skill absorbs the party's NP gauge for everyone except herself, draining between 20 to 30% NP gauge from all allies and giving it to Melt. The skill also increases her own star absorption for 1 turn between 300 and 500%, and it increases her own attack for 1 turn between 30 and 50%, all depending on level. As for her passives, Melt has Magic Resistance rank B, which increases her debuff resist by 17.5%, Riding rank C, which increases her quick card effectiveness by 6%, Independent Action rank EX, which increases her crit damage by 12%, and Goddess's Essence rank C, which increases her own damage by 200, and her debuff resistance by an additional 20%. Moving on to her deck and Noble Phantasm, Melt has a quick arts deck with quick arts buster and an arts Noble Phantasm. Her Noble Phantasm is Blue Summer Paladin. It's an AoE arts attack that deals defense piercing damage to all enemies with between a 450 and 750% damage modifier depending on level. It also removes all evasion buffs from enemies if on a waterside battlefield, and it grants Melt between 20 to 40 crit stars depending on overcharge. Melt has some pretty diverse Ascension material requirements. For leveling, she's going to need 6 seashells, 5 bicorn horns, 11 phoenix plumes, and 10 aurora steels. Seashells can be farmed at the Observatory in Babylonia, where they have a 40% drop rate. Bicorn horns have a 21% drop rate at the camping grounds in Agartha. Phoenix plumes are best farmed at the Town Hall in Salem, with a 35% drop rate, and aurora steel have a 39% drop rate at the Castle of Snow and Ice in Lost Belt 2. For skill ascension, Melt is going to need 8 bicorn horns, 12 seashells, 20 eternal ice, and 8 eggs per skill. Eternal ice drops at Yaga Moscow in Lost Belt 1 with a 45% drop rate, while eggs are best farmed at the Vol in Lost Belt 4 where they have a 12% drop rate. First we had a Phoenix themed servant, then a Sparrow, and now we have a Penguin. I'm starting to think that someone on the design team has a thing for birds. But don't let the graceful and cute design fool you. Melt is every bit as ferocious in this form as she is as an alter ego. While her attack and HP stats are somewhat mediocre, she more than makes up for it with her great NP gain and start generating, which plays right into her role as an arts NP spammer. Much like Da Vinci Lily and Musashi before her, Melt is all about NP looping and farming, and despite being a 4-star servant, she can still give those two quite the run for their money thanks to her extraordinary skill set. Her first skill, Swan Lake, grants her a 20% buff to arts cards for an impressively long 5 turns. While this skill may seem simple on the surface, it's actually amazingly versatile. 20% may not seem like much, but the strength of this skill lies in its uptime. The arts buff actually lasts longer than the cooldown, That isn't a typo, which means that this skill is effectively a permanent 20% buff to arts that Melt will always have active, increasing not only her arts and NP damage, but also bolstering her NP gain even further. And because the cooldown is only 4 turns, this skill can actually stack with itself to give Melt a 40% buff to arts every 4 turns. So not only can this skill be viewed as a passive 20% territory creation, but it can also be a mini mana burst on a 4-turn cooldown. But if that weren't enough, Melt has additional NP charge and damage steroids in her 3rd skill, Melt Envy. This skill drains up to 30% NP charge from her allies and gives it to herself. It also buffs her Star Absorb for a turn and increases her attack by 50%. One very important thing to note about this skill is that because it drains 30% NP charge from both allies, it's effectively a 60% NP charge for Melt, which makes it one of the best self-NP batteries in the game. On the downside, if Melt's allies don't have a 30% NP charge to take, Melt won't get the full 60% charge, so it is conditional. She can only gain as much as she takes. But on top of the NP charge, this skill also works as a mana burst, buffing Melt's damage by 50%. Naturally, this makes her NPs very strong, especially when combined with her arts buff. The Star Absorb is just gravy on top of an already broken skill, and it helps set up Melt for some very high burst damage if she's provided with crit stars. Finally, Melt has another versatile skill in Perfect Fluid. It's a 1-turn invincibility that increases her buff removal resistance and also sets the battlefield to water side. Invincibility is the best type of defensive skill, so it greatly helps Melt's survivability in longer fights. The buff removal resist is more situational, but it can come in handy for challenge quests, especially against enemy noble phantasms that remove buffs, because they won't be able to remove Melt's invincibility. Changing the battlefield to water also has some niche utility for helping out certain servants like Martha Ruler and Nero, but it's mostly useful because it's Melt's way of triggering her own evasion pierce on her NP. For skill leveling priority, go with Melt Envy first, since that is her strongest damage buff and NP battery, followed by the arts buff for more NP spam consistency, and then invincibility last because it's more situational. Melt's NP is an AoE arts attack that ignores defense, generates crit stars, and can remove enemy evades if used on a waterside battlefield. This noble phantasm is incredibly good from both a damage and utility perspective. In terms of damage, Melt has a lot of damage steroids to pump up her NP, so hitting over stronger than average enemy waves isn't out of the question for her. And in terms of utility, the Star Bomb can help her or other teammates with additional DPS, while the defense piercing and evasion removal are both incredibly useful in boss fights. Going back to the Da Vinci and Musashi comparisons, Melt really feels like a combination of both. She has ridiculous NP looping consistency because of her massive NP charge battery and her strong NP gain, a la Da Vinci, but she also has huge damage steroids and good utility for tougher fights like Musashi. Melt is the whole package. Her farming consistency is among the best in the game, since she is fully capable of looping on even irregular enemy waves, which can make her situationally an even better farmer than Finn or Musashi. And damage is not much of an issue for Melt, as she not only has ways of pumping up her own NP damage, but she can even deal very good sustained DPS thanks to her permanently active arts buff, her NP spam capabilities, and her ability to generate crit stars constantly. So Melt excels as both a farmer and a general arts DPS for longer fights. Melt's only major drawback is that she is a very selfish servant. She depends on draining NP charge from her allies, which means that she robs them of their ability to Noble Phantasm as well. This isn't much of an issue when it comes to farming, but it can make her more difficult to support in challenge quests. Additionally, she is still a 4-star servant, so even though her damage is good for her rarity, don't expect her NP to hit as hard as Musashi's. It's more or less the same power level as Da Vinci's, just due to the pure stat differential between the rarity. Just like with the other arts farming servants, Melt excels in team comps that provide her additional NP gain or direct NP charge. So pair her with servants like Paracelsus, Helena, and Nero Bride. Servants with party-wide NP charge skills like Helena are particularly good with Melt because she can turn a 20% party-wide charge into a 60% self-charge, while Bride and Paracelsus are the go-tos for looping since they provide so much NP gain. It also goes without saying, but Melt is one of the best servants to use with double Castoria. Melt can also work as a general arts DPS for boss fights and story quests, in which case she does pair pair well with allies who can give her strong damage buffs, like Tamamo, Mozart, and Abby. Mozart and Tamamo both have good arts buffs that Melt can take advantage of, and Mozart can even use his Star Bomb skill to set up Melt. Abby is a nice choice because her NP damage buff lasts for 3 turns, and it stacks multiplicatively with Melt's other buffs, which make it good for farming. Plus, she can also charge the party's NP gauge for Melt to steal. Melt's Bond CE is Solo Stage. It increases her arts cards by 20% and crit damage by 30% at the cost of lowering party crit damage by 10%. A very on-brand Bondcraft essence for Melt, but not really worth using. Instead, if you're going to use Melt for farming, use craft essences that give starting NP charge, like Kaleidoscope, Painting Summer, or Magical Girl of Sapphire. Black Grail is also viable in double Castoria teams later on for farming bigger enemy waves. For DPS-based teams, Melt can use craft essences that bolster NP and arts damage, like Royal Icing, Sign of a Smiling Face, Formal Craft, or even Heavenly Demon Princess if you want to focus more on crit damage. In the future, you can try to pick up Springtime Kodo Strings. It's a very good CE for Art Servants, and it also bolsters NP Overcharge, which can be useful for more of a Star Bomb effect. As for command codes, you can use anything that buffs Arts crit damage, like Gakyo no Ufude. Overall, Melt is an excellent option for a premium Arts looper at the 4-star rarity. Her ability to NP spam is unmatched outside of the top tier farmers, and she's even capable of looping on irregular enemy waves with less than 3 enemies. Her DPS output is among the best in her rarity just due to her sheer NP spam potential and her excellent damage buffs, and she even has a decent amount of utility for tackling more extreme content like challenge quests. However, do keep in mind that Melt is a selfish servant who needs to steal NP charge from her teammates, which can make her a little more difficult to build around, and while her damage is great compared to the other 4-star servants, she doesn't outdamage her 5-star looping counterparts. But as you can guess, anytime I need to start comparing a 4-star servant to a top tier 5-star servant, that means they are already broken. So Melt gets an S from me. She simply gives incredible amounts of value for her rarity. She's among the best farmers in the game, she has the versatility to be used as a DPS outside of farming, and if you're someone who wants to arts loop with Castoria, but you don't want to invest in getting a 5-star servant, Melt is statistically a much easier servant to pick up, so there's no reason to not throw a few tickets at her banner. And those are my thoughts on Summer Melt. Just like with Da Vinci Lily, I would suggest getting her to NP2 if you plan to use her a lot, but I can tell you from personal experience that she is more than worth it. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and consider subscribing if you really enjoyed the video. Join the party over at our Discord, follow us on Twitch, and follow us on Twitter. And I'll see you all in the next Servant Spotlight. Soberoni out. Later.